This is Relationscapes, the podcast where we explore the terrain of gender, sexuality, race, and more. I'm journalist Blair Hodges in Salt Lake City, and our guide in this episode about men's reproductive health is Yale University sociologist Rene Almeling.
You have a group of physicians in New York City who say, well, we have gynecology for women. We need a parallel specialty for men, and we're going to call it andrology, for male reproductive health, male reproductive organs. And what happens is they get laughed out of the pages of medical journals. They are ridiculed at medical conferences for the idea that you would specialize in the reproductive organs of half the population.
For over a century, medical scientists have invested enormous effort to understand women's reproductive health. They have a whole field for it, but when it comes to men, many of the most basic questions have barely been asked. What counts as healthy sperm? Do men have a biological clock? How do men's bodies impact child health? These knowledge gaps have real-life impacts. When couples struggle with infertility, people tend to look to women first. And when a baby is born, mothers are more likely to be praised or blamed for how things turn out. But is any of this actually fair? Sociologist Rene Almeling says no. She traces how gender stereotypes have warped our understanding of men's reproductive health and how that's starting to change. Her book is called Guynecology, The Missing Science of Men's Reproductive Health, and she joins us to talk about it right now. Rene Almeling, welcome to Relationscapes.
Thanks so much for the invitation to be here.
So when it comes to making babies, you say that men have been going on about our lives without really being bombarded with endless advice about our sperm. That's not the case for women, though. So take us to an imaginary world where men who might be interested in procreating experience the world like women do today. What would they wake up to? What would the world be like if they had the same kind of messaging that women get about making babies?
Right. Well, as probably almost any of your listeners listening today will attest, there are just sort of endless public health messages to women about their reproductive health, particularly if they're thinking about having children. And so, there are billboards, there are advertisements in magazines, their doctors will bring up with women sort of the importance of what they eat and drink and avoiding smoking and avoiding toxins. And this does not happen at all for men, even though we are starting to gather quite a good bit of data that the health of men's bodies prior to conception can affect the health of their sperm and potentially the health of their children. But men are not seeing billboards. They are not being given lists of do's and don'ts by their doctors. They're not hearing about it from friends. So there's definitely sort of a really kind of intriguing gender difference when it comes to reproductive health information.
And your book is really helpful at helping us understand how we got to where we're at today. I mean, there's an entire medical specialty dedicated to women's reproductive health. That's gynecology. And there's no similar field for men's, but we'll start to unpack how that happened, but before we get to that, let's talk for a second about sex and gender, sex/gender. And you say that tiny slash between sex and gender is a useful distinction, but it can also bring up some misunderstandings. The basic idea is sex is related to like biological stuff in people's bodies, and gender is more of like identity and like how people live in the world. But you complicate that a little bit to kind of remind us that even science itself packs in some assumptions, some gender assumptions sneak through the back door of what sex is.
Yes, absolutely. So, I think the kind of go-to thinker in this area for me is Rebecca Jordan-Young, who is a scholar at Columbia University in New York. And she's got this concept of assumption containers. And she's like, we sort of put, a whole bunch of things in the same container. We assume that somebody who has a penis makes sperm, has a male gender identity, And once you actually start to disaggregate different kinds of body parts from different gender identities, biomedical research has quite a long way to go in terms of like being precise about what they're studying. So, just as one example, somebody who might identify as a man may or may not produce sperm and may or may not sort of have the kind of genetic characteristics that you would expect would go with somebody who produces sperm. So I think there's an important effort underway to be more precise about, we're studying sperm and we have actually done the genetic testing, or we've asked people about their gender identity, rather than just assuming that all of these things line up in the way that we've historically assumed that they do.
And there's still a lot of people that resist this idea, and I assume that's why we hear that police siren behind you, is because they know that we're...
That's just because I live my office is in downtown New Haven. Yes.
Yeah. Oh, okay, good. I'm glad they're not coming to get us. Okay, yes. Good. So
gender police.
The metaphor that you use is like a nesting doll. So if we think about a nesting doll, these Russian matryoshkas where you got a doll inside a doll inside a doll, and you say, okay, so the inner doll is like our bodily processes, actual mechanics of bodies, so sperm and eggs and testicles and ovaries and this kind of stuff. And then the next doll outside of that would be individual identities and experiences, so how we experience what it's like to be in our bodies, but that's impacted by another doll around us, which is historical and cultural stuff we learn when we're kids, stuff that we learn in movies and TV, and just kind of the assumptions that are floating around in the culture. And so we'll try to keep all those things in mind as we go, because this book doesn't take a binary approach. It's not really thinking in terms, it's going to talk about male reproductive health, but you're also mindful that sex and gender are more complicated than that. So I think it's helpful to begin that way.
Yeah, I really appreciate you kind of bringing in that nesting dolls metaphor, because I think it does help people disaggregate the things that normally get mushed together. And, as I write in the book, pretty much anytime I say male reproductive bodies or men's health, I sort of want readers to imagine this preamble of bodies historically identified as male or bodies historically categorized as female. And so that's just like a little way towards what you're talking about, which is trying to just keep it in our minds that these are not sort of settled, obvious categories.
Yeah. All right, great. So let's talk about the book's title, Guynecology. It's a great play on words, G-U-Y. The word guy is in there. I think a research assistant suggested it at some point. And it reminds us in the book that there's no cohesive medical specialty for men's reproductive health, as we said. And they almost did, though. You take us back in time to the late 1800s, and there were physicians in the U.S. that tried to get a field like that going. What happened?
Yeah, so this was one of the big surprises in doing this research. So we kind of take ourselves back to the end of the 19th century. The medical profession had sort of recently become a profession. And so the American Medical Association was founded like right around 1850. And very quickly, physicians said, there's just so much knowledge, we can't keep up, we need to specialize. And so one of the earliest specialties, two of them actually, were obstetrics and GYN, gynecology. They later merge in the 1920s. But so from very early on, we kind of hive off female reproductive health and make it a separate realm of medical knowledge. And so a couple decades after that point, you have a group of physicians in New York City who say, well, we have GYN gynecology for women. We need a parallel specialty for men, and we're going to call it andrology. So they're sort of drawing on the Greek roots here in order to really express that parallelism, even in the term itself.
Right, andro.
Andro, right, yeah. So there's an effort to sort of launch a specialty for male reproductive health, male reproductive organs, called andrology. And what happens is they get laughed out of the pages of medical journals. They are ridiculed at medical conferences for the idea that you would specialize in the reproductive organs of half the population. And the reasoning behind that is because they were basically specializing in venereal disease, to sort of use the language of the day, right? So there was epidemics of gonorrhea and syphilis. We didn't have good treatments for them at that point, and they were incredibly stigmatized because it's sexuality happening outside the bounds of marriage. And so these very elite physicians who are like professors of medicine in New York City are like, oh, no, we will back up. And now we will become specialists in the genitourinary system.
Yes, urology kind of became the thing. And that's still around today. I had a vasectomy. It was from a urologist. That's who did it for me.
Exactly. So these guys became genitourinary specialists around 1905. They cut out the genito. and said even that's too stigmatized. And they became urologists, who we still have them today.
Okay, and one of the reasons this is really bonkers is because, as we discuss in other episodes, medical science is often over-focused on the male body. And you talk about this as well, that the male body has been viewed by science and medicine often as the standard. And the female body is sort of like a man's body with this other stuff, kind of like even a lesser, maybe even version of a body, that's the female. So we would assume that with that in mind, that they would focus a ton on male reproductive health and have that going already, but they didn't.
Yeah, and that really is the kind of like orienting puzzle of the research for this book is, yeah, if you have a male standard body for most of the 20th century, most medical research is being done on male bodies and assumed to generalize to everybody else, then why did they basically ignore the reproductive system? And so that's where I think we get sitting next to that male standard body is a female body that has primarily been understood in terms of its reproductive capacity and primarily studied in terms of its reproductive capacity. And so that's where you get sort of this like missing knowledge, or the gap in knowledge is male reproductive health, putting those two things together. And I think it's not an accident that some of the first people who started doing research on how male bodily health affects sperm in the 60s and 70s were women researchers. Some of those sort of early pioneers who got college degrees after World War II, stayed in the educational system, some of the first women PhDs, and they were the ones who started asking questions about why are we only studying women's bodies when it comes to reproductive outcomes?
Right. There was this time when andrology sort of went away. Like we said, urology kind of replaced it. It went away. It would take 80 years, you say, for another push to happen, for doctors to say, you know what, there should be an andrology. This is the 1960s. And it would take the discovery of things like estrogen and testosterone and labeling them as sex hormones, and then thinking about chromosomes, X and Y, and labeling those as male and female. So there was these scientific advances that would happen. And then what was the second push for andrology like then in the 60s?
Yeah, well, and I think, before I answer that, like next to those scientific advances around health and medicine and genetics, were also sort of gigantic cultural and social shifts. So in the 60s and 70s, we've also got social movements for women's rights and patients' rights and male rights. So we really do start to think about sort of the relationship between bodies and societies in a different way that makes it even possible to think of one of these male specialties. So in the 1960s, you get another group of physicians and scientists who say, we're going to create something called andrology. They did not know that they were not the first to think of this. And
they didn't have Google, so
they didn't have
look
Google.
it up.
And so they created it's sort of a specialty area, both for basic scientists, so biologists who study sperm, but also endocrinologists, some of the physicians who do sort of end up focusing on fertility or male reproductive organs in other ways. And so, there's a new journal called Andrology that gets launched. There's the International Society for Andrology. And so starting in the 60s, 70s, you do get this, kind of, I don't want to say embryonic, but you get a tiny specialty for male reproductive health. And but they're still small to this day. They're mostly people who focus on kind of the biological technicalities of sperm. So you find them in the US and fertility clinics. In other countries, andrologists are a little bit better known. They sort of do things around erectile dysfunction or sort of other sexual health issues. But in the US, there's still, there's less than, 800 andrologists in the US.
Your book is really helpful at getting us to think about how medicine advances and what it actually takes to do that. And you point out this is when journals could be published, conferences could be had, societies are founded, grant money is given, schools are developed, mentors are produced in order to build a field of knowledge about men's reproductive health. That's all the stuff they would need. And that had already been happening for gynecology for all those decades. And now they're trying to kind of get that off the ground in the 60s. So we go from the late 1800s to the 1960s and then even up to the present, and we still don't see a unified medical specialty on men's reproductive health. I think your book does a really great service in showing the cultural factors that drove us here. Race and class.
Well, and I think for the kind of primary driver of the lack of attention to male reproductive health relative to female reproductive health really is gender. I mean, certainly gender is always intersecting with social processes around race and class and sexuality. But the primary driver was really, it was just not, there was no place in the sort of medical ecosystem or the scientific ecosystem that you could plug andrology in. And so, yeah, if you have, for OBGYN, they had all of that. They had the journals, they had the annual conferences. People would go, they would meet each other, they had funding streams. And to this day, I was just at a conference a couple of weeks ago where people were still having a conversation about like where and how do you plug male reproductive health into medical training, into scientific training. There's still no sort of organized specialty that focuses on it to this day. There's much less in terms of funding streams to kind of, fund the people who are doing some of the research on sperm and health. So I think it remains a problem to this day that there's not that kind of medical infrastructure.
Mhm.
And just to, kind of spin that out even a little more, it's not really obvious, like how you go about that. So like one of the big debates that happens both in the conclusion to my book, and then I've done some work since with physicians, is it's not clear to me that we do need a specialty for male reproductive health. I think that's where, some readers will see a call for more attention to this and they're like, oh, well, you need a specialty. But I think that actually, like if you had a specialty for male reproductive health next to the specialty for female reproductive health, it just reifies the idea that there are, human bodies come in two flavors
Mhm.
and kind of underscores and reinforces that gender binary in a way that I think is not necessarily helpful. So that's probably getting a little ahead of where your questions are, but I would just kind of
No,
spin that medical specialization story out a little bit.
it's useful. Yeah, it's useful to point out. That's Rene Almeling, a professor of sociology at Yale University, and we're talking about her book, Guynecology, The Missing Science of Men's Reproductive Health. Okay, so as you said, like maybe there doesn't need to be a set field per se, but knowledge has been being created all along anyway, in different places about men's reproductive health. They were, as you said, looking into things like sexually transmitted diseases, contraception, sexual health, infertility, and these type of things. So let's talk about how the understanding of sperm shifted over these years. People were studying sperm. It's not like nobody was looking at it at all. What was the thinking about sperm, and how did that change over the course of the failures of the field of andrology to develop?
I mean, I think the first thing to say about this is, when we're thinking about reproductive health and how we think about the bodily health of individuals who may or may not be getting ready to conceive, I think that those questions have historically been asked almost exclusively about women and people who were assigned female at birth.
Mm-hmm.
So there are innumerable biomedical research agendas, lots and lots of studies about reproductive outcomes that don't include men or people who are assigned male at all. And so I think that as we sort of start to see an increase in research on sperm and male reproduction in the 60s and 70s. Where it really ticks up is in the early 2000s. And so I don't do a deep dive in sort of the causal story behind some of that, but in the book. But I do think the kind of rise of research on genetics and then epigenetics makes possible new questions about sperm and how sperm might matter.
Okay, so that makes sense why it took that long, because as you said, like the early studies would look at sperm fertility. So they were looking at like sperm counts, sperm motility. Is it swimming along? How good is it? What does the shape look like? Is it going to be able to get to the egg and in the egg? That's kind of what they were looking at. And then now, later in the 2000s, they start actually thinking about the genetic material. And this is where newer science is showing that men's health impacts babies' health apart from whether the sperm can swim fast or make it or whatever. It's also the genetic material.
Exactly right. And I think that to this day, when people hear sperm and they think health, they are still thinking in terms of those sort of characteristics of sperm count, motility, morphology. Those have been the ways that we've characterized sperm since the early 20th century.
Before I read your book, that's where I was.
Right, exactly.
For real, yeah.
And so even to this day, public health information about sperm sort of most often names its effects on sperm count, right? On how many there are or can they swim. And so there is an enormous effort needed to kind of get people's thinking to shift, not only about the kind of external characteristics of sperm, but also how a man's own health, his age, his exposures to toxins are affecting all the cells in his body, including his sperm cells, and having an effect on the kind of genetic material inside sperm in ways that are still being studied. But for example, there's pretty good evidence that increasing paternal age has been associated with an increased risk for, miscarriage, birth defects, childhood illnesses. And that is still news to most people, even though that research has been sort of building, I would say, over the last 10 or 15 years.
Yeah, well, it's funny because we think like, oh, men can reproduce into their old age. Women kind of have this cutoff around 40 or a little bit thereafter where we're like, okay, we even think like it's not safe for a woman to get pregnant at that point. But a guy can reproduce, et cetera. But we're not thinking about the genetic components of the sperm because, sperm gets replenished plenty for a lot of people, but it can contain healthier or unhealthier code depending on a person's age and other factors you mentioned. But let's dig into them a little bit more to talk about kind of the main factors that impact male sperm health: age, behaviors, and then environmental exposures.
Right. And I think the research here is probably strongest when it comes to age and paternal smoking. So the American Association of Epidemiologists has been saying since 2010 that if men are thinking about conceiving, contributing to the conception of a child, they should stop smoking because heavy smokers have what's called germline mutations in their sperm where they're actually potentially affecting the cancer risk for their children. So those are the two where it's like we have a lot of good data. The data on paternal alcohol use, paternal drug use, and then all the different environmental exposures is just much less conclusive.
Because we haven't looked at it. Isn't this weird? Like what?
Right, exactly.
But say what we do know, maybe, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the environmental exposures research is always difficult to do because we're constantly being exposed to all kinds of toxins.
And there's so many variables. How are you going to account for
Exactly.
Unless it's way obvious, maybe you live next to some sort of nuclear plant and there was a leak or something, but it could be anything in our food. It could be all kinds. It could be different types of work that men are doing. You point to a lot of different things that make it hard to pin down.
Right, exactly. Well, and I think that this is where we could sort of, really bring in the issue of different racialized inequalities and class-based inequalities that, we have a lot of good data from the environmental justice movement about the kind of relative poisoning of people that is happening due to toxic exposures.
Yeah, water and air pollution in lower class and usually, Black, Indigenous, people of color neighborhoods tend to be exposed more. So yeah, they can trace it there. Yeah.
Right. So, and I think the kind of important thing to do here too is to also sort of say there's probably an increased risk in terms of men's own bodily health, their exposures, their behaviors. But there is still a lot of work to be done on quantifying exactly how big that risk is. And so some of the, clinicians and scientists that I'm in conversation with will say, well, we don't really want to worry men. We don't want to scare men, which I think is something we never say when it comes to women.
Yeah.
So,
oh my goodness.
But that I would say would give us an opening to then say, certainly that when it comes to reproductive health information for the general public, I think we can do much better than we've done when it comes to public health messaging around women's reproductive health. Like, I don't want to just take the blame and the anxiety and the kind of stigmatizing people for their health outcomes and just spread that around to everybody else. I think the kind of newness of male reproductive health gives us an opportunity to think about how do we do a much better job when we think about, people's health outcomes and what are the causes of those. And it's not just happening at the level of the individual bodies and individual behaviors.
Yeah, your book is so helpful on this because not only is it showing us how medical knowledge is produced, right? But also how it's sent out to the public, and lots of new knowledge is being produced, but researchers and health officials aren't always sure how to send it out. And there's newspaper reporting, there's popular books, there's government agencies, but they've usually, again, focused on what women need to be doing. Here in my home state of Utah, we have this baby your baby thing where it's geared toward moms about prenatal vitamins and diet and exercise and all the kind of things. But men could pay a lot more attention to this. Researchers are starting to see that, for example, men can exercise or do certain things months ahead of when they help conceive a child that can impact their sperm. Like there's behavioral changes that men can make in diet and exercise and different things that can impact the health of their sperm. And we're not getting the word out there as much. It's almost like we think women are the ones responsible for babies and men aren't, or something. That's unusual.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I think certainly we've got that going on in the background of this. And I would say too, like when it comes to diet and exercise, there is not sort of super strong evidence that men's behaviors in terms of diet and exercise are affecting their sperm as much as their age, their cigarette smoking, and then their toxic exposure. So I do think if people are listening and they're thinking, okay, well, what individually could I do if I'm thinking about those are the things that I would sort of concentrate on.
That takes the air out of my. I was going to do a vitamin ad after this. And
I was going to say the other
I'll just
thing
cut that out.
Is happening is that there are plenty of companies trying to figure out how to make some money on all of this.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you. Thanks for that clarification. That's Rene Almeling, and we're talking about her book, Guynecology, The Missing Science of Men's Reproductive Health. She's a professor of sociology at Yale University. All right, so in the last part of your book, this gets really interesting. You survey a bunch of people about reproductive health. You wanted to see how people describe their own role in reproduction, especially men and people who identify as men. So first, you asked a lot of open-ended questions like, what's a man's role in reproduction? What were the kind of answers that you got from such a broad question?
Yeah, well, and again, just like the scientists and clinicians don't talk about male reproductive health, we social scientists do a whole lot of research on reproduction, and we've mostly interviewed women. So this is sort of one of the first interview studies with men from the general population about how they think about reproduction, which kind of blows my mind.
Doesn't it scare you that like you're like, oh no, if it's me doing it for the first time, oh no.
Right, exactly. And so we do have interview studies with men who are getting fertility treatments, or I have interviewed men who are donating sperm in sperm banks. So we had men in sort of these sites of reproductive significance, but just not your average everyday guy and how he thinks about this stuff. So I'm interviewing men and I ask them this question of, if you had to describe a man's role in reproduction, how would you describe that? And I had no idea what they were going to say. Like there were no hypotheses from the previous literature. And they sort of end up like kind of pausing and stumbling around and, a little bit they're like, but their pauses are also sort of indicating we don't have a cultural script for this. Like we don't have a way that we say that men are involved. But so they stumble around a bit and then they sort of come to this 3-part answer, which is their role in reproduction includes having sex, providing the sperm, and then being dads. So sort of more generally, providing for the family, providing financially, emotionally, et cetera. So there is, there was sort of interestingly a lot of similarity in the answers that I got, even though it's not necessarily a thing that people had something ready to say.
And you would dig a little deeper with them. You'd specifically ask them next, like how they describe the relationship between the sperm and the egg. And some of these answers were so funny and interesting. What was interesting to me was how ideas about gender roles would get wrapped up in how they described how sperm and egg interact.
Yeah, so here I did have at least a hypothesis about what people were going to say, because there is a very famous article by an anthropologist named Emily Martin, who about 30 years ago went into a biology lab and found that biologists were telling a story about eggs and sperm in which the sperm was sort of competitive, racing, trying to get to the egg, which was sort of passively lying there. And so she wrote this very famous article about how our ideas about masculinity and femininity had sort of influenced the way that biologists were, talking about eggs and sperm, the way that medical textbooks represented them. That's the story that I heard in high school was about this, agentic sperm and passive egg. And I did, from almost everybody I interviewed I did hear that story. But about half the people also told a second egg and sperm story, which was so fascinating to me that there's like another metaphor out there. And that one was a much more sort of egalitarian metaphor where people talked about eggs and sperm coming together. They were two halves of a whole. Neither one was sort of the leading, agent making it happen. And I think that second metaphor is sort of more rooted in a genetic understanding of fertilization as being 50-50. So that, that's sort of evidence that we do have sort of changing metaphors about human fertilization, which have nothing to do with eggs and sperm themselves, right? This is just about how we talk about them and how our ideas about gender change, and then we talk about eggs and sperm in different ways.
I don't remember who it was, but there was like a feminist scholar decades ago who kind of started to break down the idea of what sperm was doing. And she kind of was like, okay, we have this idea of the sperm as the conquest. It goes in and it penetrates the egg, very much like a penis penetrating a vagina, right? But she was saying, no, the egg takes in the sperm, that the egg is kind of the conquest, that it's taking it in. And even just that kind of a little shift in just how you describe a simple thing of like this going into this can make a big difference in how you think of men and women.
Yeah. Well, and so I think you're probably describing Emily Martin's article, because
Okay.
she was sort of observing in this biology lab at the time that they were figuring out that that's actually what was happening. I mean, sperm are not going in any one direction. They're kind of flailing all over. And the female musculature, the tract is sort of pushing them up towards the egg. And the egg, the process, is called chemotaxis. The egg actually sends out these chemical signals. But the thing that was interesting in my interviews was nobody told that sort of third metaphor, which was that the egg would be in charge or the egg was driving the action. I call that a missing metaphor, in the same way we've got sort of a missing science of male reproductive health.
Right. And so you point out that all the men that you talked to started off with the conquest story, that the sperm's going to the egg, and then half of them tacked on the egalitarian version of like, oh, and then these two things come together and make a baby. But you say that a third of the women only told the egalitarian version, that they didn't. So there was a third of the women who didn't start off with the conquest thing.
Yes. And so this is where I will say, in terms of social scientific methods, this was a relatively small interview study with 55 people in a small town in the northeastern United States. And so it's not something where I can sort of take those numbers and extrapolate to any broader population, but it definitely gives us some sort of preliminary evidence that there might even be gender differences in who tells which kind of fertilization story.
Yeah. There's a quote here I'll read. It says, biological stories are powerful. They both reflect and produce our collective understanding of our bodies and ourselves. And I began to wonder if men who thought in more egalitarian ways about gender relations were more likely to tell the second story. A lot more research needs to be done, right, Rene? But what do you think? Do you think the men who tacked on that additional story might be more likely to say, hey, I'm a partner with my spouse. We work together. Maybe they'll have more egalitarian life ways if they're thinking in more egalitarian ways about sexual reproduction.
Yeah. Well, and I think that, it's really hard to tell which way the arrow is going, right? Is it how they think about eggs and sperm that shapes how they think about their relationships or vice versa? But I think not only, do we have sort of from the demographers and really kind of national level survey researchers finding that younger people and more educated people are more gender egalitarian. So I think this is sort of shifting more broadly. But I would also add that, as we sort of increase the level of visibility of trans people and people who are gender non-binary, that's also unsettling our sort of cultural beliefs around sex and gender. And I would hypothesize that, as that becomes kind of a more culturally acceptable way of thinking about gender, we're probably going to see even further change in terms of how we're thinking about all kinds of bodily processes that have historically been gendered.
Well, after you asked men their thoughts about how reproduction worked, you also wanted to introduce them to some of the new knowledge that's been produced about sperm and men's reproductive health, because you wanted to see how they would react to it. Would it change the ways they thought about reproduction? So you had this pamphlet that you would have, and some of the things in it, for example, say that men can damage their sperm by drinking alcohol, smoking cigarettes, using drugs, taking certain medications, coming into contact with toxic substances, eating unhealthy foods, being overweight. Then it says that women aren't the only ones with a biological clock. New research shows that as men age, their sperm's more likely to be damaged. And it tells men that their sperm takes 2 to 3 months to grow inside the body. And then it says things that doctors encourage men to do if they're planning to have a baby, like eating a healthy diet or limiting alcohol or not smoking or using drugs during that time or avoiding sexually transmitted diseases. So you introduced them to this pamphlet. What kind of reactions did you get? Was this pretty big news to most of the people you talked to?
Yeah, there were so I was doing these interviews in 2015. And at that time, there was even less than there is today. And there's still not much out there about male reproductive health. And so several of the people I interviewed said, can I take this with me? Can I share it with my friend who's thinking about becoming a dad? So there was a lot of interest, which, I was happy to see, because it sort of suggests to me that there is a receptive audience among men for some of this information. But I also asked them, not only to tell me how they were reacting to the information, but I said, imagine, somebody that you know well, like, imagine one of your male friends, how would they react?
Mm.
And that's one way that kind of we get around what we call social desirability bias, where
Yeah.
people are
I want to
giving
look
us the
good.
answers that we expect. And so that's where I heard things about like, oh, well, men don't really care about their health. They think they're
Mm.
invincible, or, we all know that we should be eating better and taking better care of ourselves, but none of us actually do it. And then importantly, a lot of the men, especially the men who were sort of members of racialized minorities or men who were lower income, would say things like, I don't have complete control over the work that I do or the
Hmm.
chemicals that I encounter at work, or
Or the food, like certain foods are more expensive or,
right, there's food deserts.
yeah.
They pointed to healthcare inequality, so enormous
Hmm.
inequalities in the U.S. in terms of who has access to healthcare, various forms of sort of racialized inequalities. And so I think that's really powerful data coming from individuals, that it's not just individual decision making that sort of says, do I have healthy sperm or not? The health of all of our bodies is really shaped by broader social, structural, historical forces. And we have to take that into account if we're going to think about how to improve everybody's health.
Mm. Well, I mean, what do you suggest when it comes to spreading information like this about men's reproductive health? You already mentioned that you don't necessarily see the need for a full-on andrology field. You'd kind of like to see reproductive health field develop more generally, right?
Exactly.
But in terms of spreading that kind of information, who are we looking to spread that kind of info?
I think, and I sort of alluded to this earlier, but since writing the book, I have been in conversation with physicians from a number of different specialties where male reproductive health sort of bumps up against the edge of it. So, pediatrics, adolescent medicine, sexual health, endocrinology, OBGYN, urology. So, there's a number of physicians who are sort of leaders in those specialties trying to pay more attention to male reproductive health. And I actually convened with a bioethicist colleague and an OBGYN colleague. We convened a meeting with about 30 of the sperm people from the social sciences and the
Hmm.
biomedical sciences about a year ago, and had everybody speculate about sort of how do we pay more attention to sperm? How do we think about sort of the intersection of sperm with health and politics? And one of the kind of answers that we came to was I think it might need to be high school health education and high school sex education classes, which are sort of kind of infamously patchy around the US. Not everybody gets it. But for a lot of the men I interviewed, the last time they heard anything about their own reproductive system was in high school. So
Hmm.
I think that might be the best place to kind of figure out how to make this part of the curriculum, make that information more broadly available. Not all men go to the doctor, so they're not necessarily going to hear from their doctor. Certainly, the CDC and others could do some basic public health messaging around this, which they still haven't done. So there's
Why do you
there's
think they haven't? Like, why?
there's one page on the entire CDC website about male preconception health, which nobody would Google ever. Like
Yeah,
it's
yeah, I
just
wouldn't even think to look.
right, exactly. And it's still, even if you find that page, it's still very general. It's about, like what you said, like avoid STDs, make a reproductive life plan. So it's not anything about sort of the effects of sperm of all these toxins and this kind of thing. So
Hmm.
there's some pretty low hanging fruit, to use another loaded metaphor in this realm of things that we could do to get this information out there more broadly.
Now, this raises some difficult ethical questions, too, that you talk about in the book, and that's this kind of discussion about reproductive health has roots in eugenics. And this is the idea that like proper ways of procreating will create healthier bodies, and that we need to pay attention to who's procreating so that we can get the best possible human race, right? And this was kind of connected to racist ideas about like white people being out reproduced by people of color. And so there was concern that, oh, society will degenerate if white people don't keep up. And so when we're thinking about reproducing and we're telling women and men how to make the best chances for their baby and for their baby to have good health, there's also this underside of eugenics and maybe some ableist ideas about not having babies with certain disabilities. So let's spend a minute kind of talking about that side of things.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and even many of the terminology or the language in this area is sort of fraught with eugenic echoes. So people will talk about quote unquote high quality sperm
Yeah.
or healthy. Even the term healthy sperm, suggests that there is sperm that is unhealthy or sperm that is damaged. And so in the conclusion of the book, I reflect a little bit about, this is, it's important health information, but we have to be so cautious about not taking that next step that the eugenicists were happy to take, which was to then start saying who should or should not be reproducing on the basis of the quality, and I think to even think about genetics in terms of quality is something that we should not be doing. And so I think this is really about thinking about kind of population health. Like, how do you think about whether or not a body is healthy? And this goes back, decades for public health researchers, that we know what it takes to improve the health of all bodies, whether they are reproducing or not. And that's to give them, access to good health care and clean air and lead-free water, and, like all of these sort of basic public health infrastructure programs, which would benefit everybody's body, whether or not they're planning to have kids. And so that's actually where I end up coming down, which is sort of the pie in the sky recommendation that so many medical sociologists and public health folks make at the end of the book, which is, why do we spend bajillions of dollars on all of the highest tech medical stuff when we know what some of the basic things are that actually work. So I think that's one way to kind of avoid falling in that eugenic trap of thinking about any one person's or one group's reproduction, is to think about how we improve the health of everyone.
That's Rene Almeling, a professor of sociology at Yale University, author of the book Guynecology, The Missing Science of Men's Reproductive Health. And Rene, you've also written a book called Sex Cells. This is another pun, Sex Cells. It's spelled C-E-L-L-S, Sex Cells, the medical market for eggs and sperm. How did that book connect with this one? Did this book kind of grow out of that research?
Yeah, so the book on sex cells is about the market for egg donors and sperm donors in the US. And that was my first book. It came out of my dissertation research, where, it was one of the first sort of big comparative studies of how we organize the market for eggs versus the market for sperm. And I also find there various ideas about gender shaping, the kind of ways that egg donors were recruited. So they were asked to give the gift of life, whereas sperm donors were sort of thought to be doing this kind of job, an easy job for money. So there was all kinds of ways that gender sort of, kind of made itself a part of that market as well. And then, yes, this more recent book on GYN gynecology grew out of that because I had been paying attention to sperm for a very long time and started seeing some of these headlines around 2010, 2012 about male biological clocks and paternal effects and the effects of male bodily health on sperm. And, that was where I was just kind of like, well, how did this take so long to just ask this very basic question? So no, they're definitely connected. I don't know that I'm going to be doing anything else on sperm for a while, though.
You're all spermed out. All right.
Yes, exactly.
Do you find that people are curious about your own personal connection to it? Because as a person who's studied eggs and sperm and all of this, do people wonder, I mean, you talk about how science is situated, right? And the questions we ask are kind of generated by our experiences and stuff. So do people ask, are you a mom? Or do you get a lot of questions about that?
I do, well, and I think all social scientists who are doing research on topics sort of get asked those questions. As we teach our graduate students in our methods classes, everybody is producing knowledge from a particular standpoint, and you just can't escape it. We are humans studying humans. The thing that's so funny about sort of having done this now for 25 years is that when I was a graduate student studying egg donors, I was asked, well, surely you must be interested because maybe you're an egg donor because I was 23. And now I'm, in my mid 40s, and people say, well, did you use an egg donor? And so that has also changed over the course of my life course. But I have not ever had any personal connection to any of the reproductive technologies I've studied, to any of these sort of medical specialties around sperm. Although I did, as my partner and I were trying to have a child, I did drag him along to appointments to see if they would say anything to him about his sperm, and they did not.
Yeah,
so
shocker.
I did wrap my own family into the research process at different points.
All right. That's Rene Almeling. We're talking about the book Guynecology, The Missing Science of Men's Reproductive Health. All right, Rene, we like to conclude every episode with regrets, challenges, and surprises. This is an opportunity for you to talk about something you might change about the book now that it's out. Oh, I kind of regret that about it. Or something that was most challenging in creating the book, or something that surprised or changed you as a person in the course of doing that research. And you can speak to one, two, or all three of those things. It's up to you.
Okay. What a great last question. Well, I would say the thing that just kind of pops right into my head is that the entire process of researching and writing this book on male reproductive health felt a little bit like a tightrope. And that is because I was writing it at a time when there had been sort of enormous and kind of concerted attacks in terms of, women's reproductive rights, their access to abortion, even their access to contraception. And now we're seeing their access to IVF. So, I think to be writing about male reproductive health at such a fraught time for reproductive politics in the US made me feel like on almost every page, I wanted to be like, male reproductive health is important, but this does not mean that men should have any decision-making power whatsoever over pregnant people's bodies. So, which I do say at a couple of points in the book, but that's the thing that sort of felt the kind of most, sort of difficult in terms of writing it. And it has only become more difficult since the book came out in 2020.
Yeah, you're the researcher that's like, what about men? Like,
yes, exactly. And yet, I would say that as a gender scholar, I think that it is crucial that we don't only talk about women and we don't only study women, because it's part of the whole point of saying gender affects everybody.
That's right. How about any challenges or surprises? Did you bump into any of those?
I mean, I was actually really surprised to find out about this episode. This goes way back to the beginning of our conversation, but this episode in the 1890s where there was an attempt to launch this specialty that I think, if we sort of play out that thought experiment of what would it look like if that had succeeded, I think reproductive health care probably looks really different. And, there were a couple of historians in like a sentence or two who had sort of mentioned andrologists at that time, but I kind of had to go learn how to be a medical historian in order to write this chapter.
Yeah.
And so that was a really intriguing discovery. And I think is kind of powerful for that, like, as you said, the story of like how we got to this point of this male standard body and this female reproductive body.
Yeah, I enjoyed that. I hadn't heard anything about that as well. And so the stuff that you found is really eye-opening, especially in terms of how medical knowledge is produced and how contextual that medical knowledge is. And I think we all need to keep that in mind for all, I'm very scientific minded. I love the sciences, but I also try to be humble about it and recognize that we're all situated and we've got plenty more to learn too.
Right. Well, and the whole point of research like this is to try to figure out how to make the science and medicine better. Right. It's not an anti-science critique. It's not an anti-medicine critique, but that, if we sort of are able to identify the ways that different cultural beliefs around gender or race or class or sexuality are shaping the science that we make, then it will help us to do a better job.
Well, that's Rene Almeling, a professor of sociology at Yale University, author of the book Sex Cells, The Medical Market for Eggs and Sperm, and also the book we talked about today, Guynecology, The Missing Science of Men's Reproductive Health. Rene, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about the book with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
That's it for this episode of Relationscapes. And if this is your first time with us, welcome to the journey. I hope you'll check out some other episodes while you're here. If you're enjoying the show, please rate and review it in Apple Podcasts, or if you listen in Spotify, you can rate it there as well. Another way you can help me grow the show is by recommending it to a friend. So if somebody in your life came to mind while you were listening, send them a link. If you want to see some video clips from this episode and some other bonus stuff, you can follow me on Instagram or TikTok. Mates of State provides our theme music. I'm your host, Blair Hodges, an independent journalist in Salt Lake City, and I hope to spend more time with you soon here on Relationscapes.